Good evening. Welcome everybody to vBrownBag US. Tonight we have Keith Townsend at CTO Advisor, who is going to give us a very cool presentation on, home labs and using the Intel NUCs. Actually, let me go ahead and put this big here. Some quick notes that we always do in the shows. Remember that any major IT conference, we're probably going to be there try to do tech talks. In this case, in about 2 weeks, VMworld EMEA is kicking off. So make sure to stop by the booth and sign up for presenting. Those are always fun, great sessions that everybody gets to see the YouTube videos. Actually, Keith, I did get to see your video. You made a pretty fun one.
Yeah, that
Get
was
in.
fun.
It was a lot of fun. It was. I think it was viral for a little bit. And as always, get in on the conversation in Twitter. Those are our Twitter hashtags. We are distributed regionally. We have APAC, EMEA, Latin America, which is one that I'm always there, and of course US. Again, our presenter today, Keith Townsend. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and I'll send you presenter role.
All right, so I have an introduction slide, so I'll save the narrative for that. I want to make sure that we get gist for those of you listening to this either on YouTube or via the podcast out the way. We're going to learn about Intel NUCs and how to use Intel NUCs in our home labs and why. So basically the how, where, and why I chose the Intel NUC. For a quick reminder, this is Keithtober, October 2016. I'll be doing the brown bags for all this month, with the exception of the week that the vBrownBags will be taking a break for VMworld Europe. I will not be going to VMworld Europe, and vBrownBag will put on, I think, their normal big show around
Keith,
VMworld.
for some reason, I think I lost you, and that's weird. I can't see your screen.
Okay, hold on a sec. Might have did that when I went full screen.
Yeah, I can see you now. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. It was on. I think it was one when I went full screen. All right. So, quick intro. Who am I? Did a pretty good job at the beginning. Introduced me. I'm on Twitter at CTO Advisor, and the blog is thectoadvisor.com. That's it for the intros. We're going to jump right into the agenda and the meat of the conversation. I think you only have 9 slides, and we're on the third one now. I'm not a big slides type of guy. I think especially this topic, we can all talk about home labs probably forever. So I wanted to make sure that we talk, have a conversation. Please raise your hand, ask questions throughout. I want to make this as interactive as possible. The whole point is to help you make some decisions around your home lab. We'll talk through how where I got the idea, how did I come to the NUC decision, and then we'll talk through the design and build, and then we'll actually kick the tires on my lab. It's been about a month since I've logged into it, and we'll walk through what I'm using it for currently today. Today is a vSAN cluster. Actually, if you search for the hashtag building vSAN, I tweeted the journey quite a bit, so you can follow kind of that path of the few days it took me to build the lab, pictures and commentary. I thought it was a pretty fun experience. So first off, let's credit where credit is due. A lot of I just basically stole William Lamb's guide to building a virtual lab, specifically building vSAN using his vSAN 6.2 Intel NUC lab. I want to make sure I state this. While his lab focused on vSAN, you can use this lab for building a Nutanix Nutanix community node. You can use it for a Docker cluster if you're going to do VM. I chose it to do VMware vSphere and the vSAN, but one of the things that I played around with before I installed vSAN was installing Nutanix Community Edition on one of the NUCs. That didn't turn out too well for me, and I don't think this has anything to do with the community. With the Intel NUC itself. I think it's speaks to the difficulty of installing Nutanix's community lab. I think the preferred method that they talk you through doing it, if to kick the tires, is to do a Revelo lab, and they have some NUC post out there for creating the community lab on a NUC. It just simply didn't work for me. So that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah. And we all, honestly, we all steal from Win and Lamb a lot, so I understand. And I also just ran a Nutanix CE demo in my home lab, but I ran everything nested, and that even took a little coaxing. So totally get you.
Yeah, it was quite the experience. All right, so let's talk about some of the options that I had when I set out on this. The first was cloud first. You know what? I treat my lab like I treat options at work, which is force myself to look at cloud options for a lab. And for quite some time, outside of my VMware workstation lab, so I have a pretty robust workstation with 32 gig of RAM, VMware workstation on it, an i7 processor, so I can do quite a bit in there. Nested VMs, 32 gig is enough to do a 3-node ESXi cluster with 8 gig each. And, as we move into like vSphere 6.0, 8 gig kind of becomes a pain point to run a nested lab in. You probably want to give it more like 16 gig. So I was starting to feel the strain of my 32 gig workstation when it came to specifically VMware labs. You can even run like a Nutanix CE lab in workstation if you can finagle it. It's possible, and you can obviously do it. You need 16 gig of RAM. So in my workstation, there was enough space, but it was long in the tooth. My lab is about 4 or 5 years old, so it was at that refresh stage. The options were obviously for cloud, AWS, Azure, and Google Compute Engine. All of these, if we're doing Docker, if you're doing Windows MCSE training, if you're doing general Linux admin stuff, DevOps type of stuff, obviously if you're training for AWS certification or Azure GCE certification, those are great options. Azure even supports some nested, or not supports, you can do some nested Hyper-V inside of Azure, but I am still primarily a VMware guy when I mess around with physical stuff. So I needed a lab that could run VMware vSphere. That kind of eliminated AWS, Azure, GCE as my primary labs. Not to say that I don't use them today. I still do. I have a course on Pluralsight for, this is a plug. I have a course on Pluralsight deep diving into AWS security. And obviously, I can use all of the free tier to do anything I need to do on AWS. But for the serious big metal stuff, I need more capability. So if you're a V expert, Revelo is a pretty good option. I think they give us 100 free hours a month of Revelo. So Revelo, if you're not familiar with it, is an overlay on top of Google Compute Engine and AWS, and they have this cool virtual hypervisor that you can run nested ESX. So you can run vSphere in AWS or Google Compute in this extracted layer. You can actually upload VMDKs up to it, or other virtualization formats, and they'll take those things in and boot those VMs as if you're running it on a local vSphere host. Really cool. The disadvantage, one, it can get to a point, if you want it on all the time, it can get costly. Another disadvantage is that it's quite slow. So when I think Scott Lowe did some crazy 32-node vSAN cluster on Ravello. If you were to mimic the same lab, it would take literally maybe a couple of hours to boot all of that up. My basic 3-node vSphere cluster with a Windows vCenter server was taking roughly 25 to 30 minutes to boot up. And I don't have a whole lot of time to mess around in my lab. When I want to mess around in the lab, I want to get in, get out, maybe get in a 30, 35 minutes, up maybe maximum of an hour of time practicing stuff in the lab. Hands-on technology is not what I do anymore in my career from a day-to-day. So I don't have a whole lot of time, and there's not a huge return on my value or on my time to do labbing. So when I do it, I want to get in, get out. So Ravello kind of fails me in that aspect. If you have a spare 30 minutes to wait for the lab to boot up, Ravello is most definitely a fine solution. Once it's up, it runs fine. The performance doesn't bother you as much. Then the other option, what I've used in the past, the bloke from the VMware podcast that doesn't do it anymore, the co-host, I forget his name. I'll remind it. But I was listening to a community podcast, and they recommended this service, baremetal.com. Is really cool. They actually rent out bare metal servers. So you can provision an ESXi server with like 128, I think the max is 128. It might be 96 gig of RAM. And you can use Alistair's automation script to bring up node in bare metal. They actually have it there to bring up a nested ESXi cluster, and you're up and running within kind of minutes. So that was actually pretty cool. They don't charge you for storage. It is a real option. I just wanted to play around. So I haven't touched. They don't let me touch a keyboard in real life anymore in production, and I wanted to be able to touch real live equipment. So I don't have a really good excuse for not using baremetalcloud.com other than the fact that I wanted to touch real hardware. So that brought me to the home lab options. Basically, with home lab, you have two options depending on your budget. I'll go right off the bat. Cost. This solution cost me about $2,100. It was not cheap. So for $2,100, you have some real good options when you're talking about overall capacity, and we'll get to speeds. I have a speeds and feeds slide a little bit later. But one of the real debates that I had was, do I just buy a server class workstation or desktop, or a actual server with the $2,100? Or do I go with William Lamb's NUC solution? You get more or less comparable specs. The Super Micro Xeon D, I don't know if you guys have seen some of the posts around that, but entry-level Xeon system that you can install 128 gig of RAM. Out the door, you can get 10 gig internet, 10 gig Ethernet. You can install SSDs galore in the box. You can get some really great performance. So as far as nested ESXi, my primary use case, you can get 3 nodes easily in that box. You can actually get 4 of 128 gig. So you can get 4 32 gig nodes if you want 32 gig. Or you can scale up and get 128 gig single host with quite some capacity to do an awful lot of cool stuff. Hindsight, I think I would have I'll save the suspense. Hindsight, I think I would have chosen that option. Here's the problem that I've run into with my lab. I get 96 gig of RAM. I have 6 cores. It is a robust lab, but the problem that I run into is when I need to scale up beyond 32 gig for a single node or a single VM. And I underestimated how often I'd actually have that use case. When you have 96 gig of RAM, you want to try and use as much as that 96 gig of RAM sometimes in a single node. A practical use case. The Azure Stack preview requires a single 96 gig VM if you want to nest it. In my home lab, I can't do it. In the Xeon lab, I could do it. So that's kind of one of those lessons learned. And then when we get to the bomb piece, I'll talk about some of the other limitations, some of the advantages, but also some of the limitations of this scale-out solution that I chose. Obviously, if you have a...
it's always about the requirements, right? You have to figure out what your requirements are.
Yeah, so even in a home lab, you have to figure out what your requirements are. I thought a lot of my requirements, a lot of stuff that I'd be learning in the new home lab would be like Docker clustering, container clustering, VIC, maybe some NSX. So even my lab is a little challenged for NSX because NSX can be a little beefy on the controllers can be a little beefy on a single ESX host with only 32 gig. 32 gig is probably the overhead for NSX in the lab. So, I had some of those concerns. My networking options are limited, so I'll talk through that. Overall, I'm happy. It was a fun experience, but if you are serious about, especially this vSphere use case, think carefully about what your requirements are when it comes to the types of workloads you're going to run inside of the lab. So I got to the point that I've decided that I'm going to go this NUC route. And the form factor, I'm showing this picture because it's pretty cool. At one point I had it underneath my desk. My wife came in and said, you know what, that's a little bit too much clutter. You need to find a permanent space for it. But as far as size-wise, these things are pretty comparable in size to a Mac Mini. They're actually much smaller than a Mac Mini, and they're extremely quiet. They don't have a fan. So from a form factor, the form factor was extremely cool. Some of the things I didn't like off the bat. You can't tell in this picture, but obviously I have a USB on the backside. I have a USB 3 port, a USB 2.0 port, headphone jacks, which obviously doesn't serve us any purpose in our use cases. And then on the backside, I think there's yet one other USB port and a single NIC, and it's a 1 gig NIC. Obviously, if you're talking about ESX and you're talking about vSAN and you want to try and separate out your storage traffic from your VM traffic to your management network traffic, you have one 1 gig port. You can work around that with adding a USB dongle and adding a few more ports, but again, you're not going to get 10 gig Ethernet in this form factor. But overall, I knew that coming in, and again, I don't do this. I don't do vSphere every day for a living anymore. I just need to be able to touch, fill it, run some stuff, and vSphere is more of a practical utility for me so that I can learn other stuff. I'll put other workloads inside of vSphere to run, Docker clustering. I can add additional virtual switches to create a distributed switch that has no need to connect to a physical network. So the single 1 gig port wasn't a limiting factor for me. There are other options on the market. So when you go to somewhere like Amazon.com and you search for this mini PC form factor, there's options that have like 2 gig ports, multiple the form factors themselves are just much more appealing. There was a couple, I think, in this size that I read that you could squeeze up to 64 gig of RAM. These are limited to 32 gig of RAM each. But I'm a bit risk averse when I'm spending my own money. I was going to shell out $2,100 for this. I want support. So if this thing breaks, I think one of them was DOA when I got it, so I just sent it back, and no questions asked. I got another unit. Intel, obviously, if you don't follow Intel NUC on Twitter, that social group is actually pretty active, and you can get support from those guys directly. When the Skull Canyon first came out and people had problems troubleshooting it installing it on an Intel on the Canyon, and I'll get into what the Canyon is in the next slide. Intel was like just right on it. The other solutions from kind of the no-name places basically didn't offer that. There was no guaranteed or pseudo-guaranteed support for vSphere. The motherboard and chipsets kind of looked like it would support vSphere, but again, I didn't want to take the risk. I want to get a minimum of 1 year out of this lab, so I chose Intel NUC mainly because of the Intel name and the support behind it. So there's the question between what NUC. If you're coming into this new, I spent maybe about a week and a half, 2 weeks, even after reading Williams' blog, kind of deciding on which NUC to get. When you do a search on Amazon or any Egghead or wherever you buy your hardware from, you're going to get a slew of options when it comes to the NUC. The first thing is going to be, do you want a bare bones system or a pre-configured system? I don't think there's anyone here that will get a pre-configured system because the specs just don't meet our home lab needs. If you're going to get a pre-configured system, you might as well just walk to Best Buy and buy a off-the-shelf PC because you're going to get similar specs. It's not going to be a SSD. You're going to get a spinning disk. Memory is not going to be adequate to do what you need to do when it comes to advanced labs. Pre-configured configurations are basically, in my opinion, a waste of money. You're going to want to take some time to customize your solution. William, I think at the time he posted his post, took the most optimal solution. There's some debate on, and I took some liberty with the caching layer when we talk about SSDs. I took some liberty on what I did with SSDs, but for the most part, I stuck with his overall plan. There are still a glut of 5th generation NUCs out there. So when you go to look, be careful with that, especially if you want 32 gigs of RAM. The 5th gen NUC only officially supports 16 gigs of RAM. I've read posts on, there's a company that they do it with laptops too, that they have a special DIMM that will go up to 32 gig of RAM. But you know how vSphere is, and I didn't want to tempt it to save $70 on each node. It just wasn't worth it to me. Especially since that those 32 gig or those 16 gig DIMMs would have been a little bit more expensive anyway. I went with the 6th gen, which is the latest Intel SKU, which has 32 gig support from Intel. Critical part of my component. 16 gig of RAM I think just doesn't cut it anymore for vSphere hosts, not even in the lab, not if you can afford it. So the cool box is the Skull Canyon, which is about twice the size of the regular Intel NUC. The cool thing about Skull Canyon is that it has a i7 processor. The 5th and 6th gen regular size NUCs or regular brand NUCs only go up to an i5. So, and we'll get into this in the bomb slide. That is, I'm indifferent when it comes to CPU for vSphere, especially in the lab. I have a 5-year-old i7 for my desktop that I've just made a alternative vSphere host. I don't run into CPU problems in my lab. So I think the only advantage of the i5 over the i3 is that you get 4 cores per box versus 2 cores. So instead of having 6 cores, I could have ended up with 12 cores. Again, CPU cores is not a bottleneck in my lab, so as far as requirements goes, not too big of a deal. So Skull Candy obviously supports i7, and with the i7 support comes 64 gig of RAM support. That's actually a big deal. But once I did the cost analysis, I found that the Skull Canyon configuration was basically twice the cost. And if I wanted to max out my lab, I was looking at probably about high $3,000 to $4,000 in total lab costs. And again, we're just going beyond my budget. And once you give me more money, I probably would have selected a different platform than the NUC platform in general. Any questions so far on which NUC?
I don't have particular questions. The Twitter is actually very active, people sharing what they've done. One thing I do know about the Skull Canyon that you're probably going to mention at some point, but I thought it was, sorry, I'm barging in here, but I think it is the first fan model that is not fanless, right? So this is the actual one that actually has a little noise with it.
Yeah, and I think that's and I think sometimes we can be a little selfish in our bubble. We look at the Intel NUC and we look at it as those are lab machines. And I don't think I don't think Intel is targeting the enthusiasts, the home lab enthusiasts for these machines. A lot of practical use cases for these machines outside of our community is for, especially the fanless models, are going to be for media center devices, secondary machines in like a loft area, those types of things. The Skull Canyon, is actually and you can tell by the design, it is a entry-level gaming machine. So noise and fan is not as much of an issue as performance is the driver. So a lot of the Skull Canyon just didn't meet my requirements. It was about form factor and overall capacity, bang for the buck, being able to scale out. So I can still, again, for basically if you simple math, I spent $2,100 on the lab. For $700 a node, I can scale out my vSphere cluster to another node. So I plan on getting as many years as possible out of this equipment, and I don't know if I'll ever retire it. I might have to I might create a secondary cluster or enable EVC on it or something, but I'm expecting that next bump I'll be able to add 64 gig nodes to either the cluster or create a secondary cluster and add to this piece. The Skull Candy makes it a little bit, it makes those blocks, those bricks for expanding the cluster a little bit bigger. And from a heat and noise perspective, it's less appealing. So that was a good point. I was not going to touch on the fact that it has a fan.
Yay.
All right, so my bomb. So let's talk a little bit about the Intel NUC part number so you guys can kind of decipher this a little bit. The first part, so I have 3 of these. The NUC 613SYH is the i3 bare bones. So to quickly read this, the 6 indicates the generation of Intel CPU. So obviously the 5th generation NUC would have a 513 for the i3. The i5 is 1.5 versus 1.3. So if we were looking at a i5 NUC, it would be 615 SYH. So that's simple, just to simply read and go through quick. So when I was doing price comparisons, I got pretty good at identifying kind of the best purchase price for the NUCs. And when we talk about purchase price, I didn't put the purchase price on here. I think it was the list price for this when I bought it 2 months ago or 3 months ago was $299. The cheapest I found these for was for $230 with an Amazon Prime special. So Amazon runs Prime special sometimes where these guys are $230. I found out the hard way that places like Fry's will not price match that pricing because Amazon never makes it never shows that actually in stock for the Prime inventory. So places like Fry's won't honor the price match. So I ended up buying one from Fry's for $2.99, thinking that I would end up getting the price match, and I didn't. And I was too anxious to get the lab done, so I didn't return it. I ended up just eating the $70 difference in keeping the device. The AWS, normally when they run that special, it's usually a 2-day extra wait to get that price. So obviously, if you're buying 3 of these things, $210 is obviously worth the wait for a couple of days, in my opinion. I found the memory to be the price to be a wide difference. Again, in Fry's, they wanted $100 per module for the memory, whereas this Crucial module was, I think, half that price. So I still haven't found anywhere where you can walk in and just buy this memory. Again, it's kind of, you have to look online to get the best price for the single 16 gig DDR4s. They're actually not easy to find. Fry's had them, but only had they didn't have these. They had a different vendor, a different manufacturer, and they only had 2 of them in stock. So I couldn't source those personally. And then for the capacity layer, I chose the Samsung Evo 850. I didn't want to play around with the SSD. So I didn't make mention of this. This is an all-flash lab. So for $2,100, I got an all-flash lab. 3 Evo 550s. I can't remember if William Lamb at the time that 250 was kind of the sweet spot for memory, but I have basically 1.5 terabytes of raw capacity, and I'm running vSAN 6.2, which means that I get erasure coding. So we'll take a look at what the effective capacity is when we take a tour of my vSphere environment. So that's the capacity layer. And again, we're talking, in this use case, vSAN. If we're talking Nutanix CE edition, this would be the capacity layer for Nutanix. And then for the caching layer, we went with Samsung 951's 128 gig M2s. This is something to kind of watch out for. There's a big difference in cost and availability of a 256 gig module that's a older generation. So these were like $90 or $90 to $110 each. And I happened to walk into Fry's, one of my favorite places. If you haven't noticed, I like Fry's.
Yeah.
I walked into Fry's, and they had I didn't have the model number right in front of me, and they had a 256 gig module, and it was that M.2 form factor, and I brought it, but it's a much slower device than the 128 gig was. So in my cluster, I have mixed cache layer. One of the devices has a 256 gig slower M.2 device, and the other two have the faster 128 gig cache layer. Yeah. I figured it shouldn't, it shouldn't be a huge deal for my lab. Maybe one day I'll regret the decision, but it shouldn't be too big of a problem. By far, my biggest regret is the USB drives that I picked. Let's go back to the picture. Let's see if I have it here. Next one. So, if you notice those black USB devices with the red tags on it, those are my USB devices. They're 8 gig each, so they were like, they were cheap. They're USB stick. They're 8 gig USB sticks. They were like $8 a piece, something like that, really cheap. The biggest mistake that I made is that they're not low profile. So when you put them inside of the USB stick, when you put them in the USB sticks inside of the devices, whether they're in the front or in the back, it's a cabling nightmare. I should have bought low profile USB drives, like the ones that I'm looking at in my service book. Would have made just function as both aesthetically and functionally from a cable management perspective, would have made a really big difference. So don't buy the Cruise USB drives that I have on my picture. The other thing to make note with, and I don't think they've fixed this, it took me a few hours to work this through. I kept creating my bootable image for vSphere onto the USB sticks, and the boot kept failing, and I could not figure out why. Come to find out, the NUCs have this problem that it can't boot from anything. It can't boot from flash to anything bigger than 8 gig. So if you're using something larger than 8 gig, the NUC won't boot until you flash the BIOS. And of course, if you're using a 32 gig USB stick to flash the BIOS, that won't work out too well.
Yeah, it's funny. That's a good tip right there.
Yeah, it took me a couple of hours to figure that out. And I'm not, so I don't have anything installed on my flash from a OS perspective. I'm running vSphere from the USB sticks directly. That was a tip from the William Lamb post. So any questions on the presentation part, kind of the BOM, my decision-making process, anything like that?
I don't have anybody that raised a particular question for you. People are saying they like fries as well, of course. And I tweeted out a comparison of that M2, the SM951, versus the 950 Pro, which is the other NVMe commercial drive that came out a bit later, and a lot of people have been using for vSAN. One thing I will comment, especially if you're planning on doing these for vSAN, remember, none of this is on the HCL, right? So don't expect your health checks to actually show green. I bought exactly what Keith said on the vBrownBag. Yeah, this is the disclaimer. The vSAN.
Well, you're about to learn that that's a good point. You're about to learn that in my lab. I cannot get my health check to turn green. So
yeah,
that's a very good caveat. You're about to see that when we enter the actual when we go into the vSphere client.
Yeah, there's John Nicholson, which is an expert in vSAN, right? He works from VMware, has explained to us in the vExpert Slack several times. Listen, guys, consumer SSDs don't have at least the 2 data protection capacitors that we need on the SSDs, so they will never make the HCL. Stop asking.
There was one other caveat too. So and I think that's another VMware in general. It's a little off topic, but I think it's related. I have a old SPS 15 laptop it's an i7 machine, so it's 4 core, and I have 16 gig of RAM on it, so it's a decent machine. And one of the use cases that I thought about was to do to make it a vSphere host, just to add to, just to have it's a quiet, it's a laptop, so it's relatively quiet. It doesn't take up that much heat, and it doesn't take up that much power, so I can throw it into the cluster. I bought an SSD for it, and I was going to buy a capacity layer, a second SSD for a capacitive layer, because they have aftermarket slots you can buy to put 2 drives in internally. Hard lesson learned. In vSphere 6.0, they changed the NIC driver. They actually blacklisted the NIC driver, so you can't install. You have to go through you have to slipstream the drivers. You cannot install ESXi on it, because vSphere would actively say you can't use the NIC. So don't discount. The HCL is important. Any configuration, if you're going to deviate from the configuration I use, William Lamb used, or somebody else used, you're doing it at your own risk. The Skull Canyon is a great example. It took about 2 or 3 weeks for Intel to work out it ended up being, of all things, a video card issue on not being able to install vSphere on that. So if you're going to deviate from a tried and true configuration, do so at your own risk, or at least have a pretty generous return policy, so that if it doesn't work, you can take it back. All right, so we are going to share my remote desktop, and we'll take a look at vSphere running on this cluster. So again, remember, I'm not a vSphere guy. I'm a V expert. I don't do this day to day anymore. So I'm really counting on you guys to look at vCenter and say, hey, Keith, can you drill into this? Show me something, because I don't know what you want to see. I'm just, I built this thing, I installed vSAN. I installed vSphere. I installed vSAN. I created the volumes, and I threw vCenter on here, which was actually an interesting feat. I'm trying to remember how I did vCenter in an interesting way. I actually did vCenter vCenter is running on my vSAN data store, which was not easy to do. And I won't go to it in this, but I will write. It deserves a blog post to get.
I think William has a blog post on saying, okay, so you want to start the management cluster, but you want to start it on the vSAN data store, so you have to bootstrap the cluster on the first host and then add the other clusters. And he has a whole procedure. I know what you mean.
Yes, it was not. It was. So actually, what I did, I can share what I did. I think we have time, unless there's questions. We're going to finish early, and so we not that early. I built it in VMware Workstation.
We do have a question though. Funny you said that we don't have one, because Tim Smith said, "Oh, I'll be the brave guy." So Tim, the Microsoft control is yours. If you unmute yourself, you can probably talk.
Yeah, I was curious, Keith, if you could just show the vSAN config under the cluster there, and also, are you still running just single NIC? Have you thought about, because I think isn't a USB NIC made possible now for certain drivers to be able to add an additional NIC to the NUCs? NIC to the NUCs.
Yeah, there are some NICs that you can add through USB, and William is basically the source for all the community, right? He did put out which ones they are, and he actually worked with people to get the drivers out there. But this is my opinion, and Keith can give his opinion. Honestly, if you're going to do like, you need an extra NIC because of redundancy or this or that, you probably didn't go with NUCs in the beginning just because, they're really not a full humongous lab, right? I did see some people asking, oh, well, if I use a double NIC, do I get all the bandwidth on the double NICs? And it just so happens that no, you can't. You can have the two NICs, but you will not have all the bandwidth because USB doesn't support it. So
yeah, so if you talk about like a practical limitations, you're still talking about over USB. So it's more of a logical thing. If you want logically to see what it's like to play around with multiple NICs, yes, the USB 3 option is a great option. However, you're not going to get much more capacity by adding multiple NICs. It's more about being able to see what it looks and feel like to have multiple NICs. And remember, that's a cabling cabling. It's not a nightmare, but it's a cabling inconvenience. If I have multiple NICs hanging off a USB port, and then I have that cabling going into a switch, it just doesn't look all that. You have to be pretty good at setting up that cabling. So Tim, walk me through what buttons you want me to press.
Sure. Let's just go to the host and cluster view, and let's do the Manage tab and General under vSAN. Oh, I'm sorry, Disk Management, just to see.
Oh, not this guy.
Yeah, the one right below it. Sorry. Just to see your disk groups and the disks, and how they're showing up on a NUC.
And notice I'm getting the warnings because of, and I ended up figuring out that it was just a HCL issue that I'm just going to always, and just like everyone else, I hate seeing the exclamation point. Functionally, I haven't seen any performance issues, but this has been my problem.
And Nick and Keith, maybe you can maximize or press F11 to go full screen on your browser window.
I can do that. Trying to remember how to send an F11 through a Mac. Somebody, I think Frank Denneman just posted that on Twitter, and I think I'm going to need that.
Or just go ahead and maximize.
You know what? Let's first off, let's do.
There you go. And you can probably click on the axis there.
I have this really small on my Mac, so if making it bigger helps, let me know.
Yeah, but you can also click on the X on the lower pane and the right panes, and the top yellow bar, and that will help you. There you go.
All right, so Tim, walk me through, where did you want to go back to? Manage.
And settings and disk management. And yeah, just click on one of your disk groups, and then the if you can pull that slider up a little bit so we can see the
There we go.
Now,
see the hardware.
Yeah, and both of yours were detected as flash, right? You didn't have to tell vSphere this is not a hard disk drive.
No, I did not. I was able to. I ran into one of the nodes. I ran into problems that it wouldn't detect the. It would detect the cache layer, but it wouldn't detect the capacity layer. And what did I end up doing? I ended up removing the host from the cluster and re-adding it, and that fixed it for some reason.
Yeah, no, and also especially the NVMe driver that didn't come out until 5.5 update 3 or 6.0, I think. So you
So
need
I
to make
thought I
sure.
would have a problem with, and I thought I would have the problem with NVM drives, and it wasn't those. It was surprisingly the 950 that it didn't detect the 500 gig, say just a regular capacity drive.
Hmm. Hmm.
It wouldn't detect, so I couldn't. I had troubles creating my first the first data store or the only data store.
Yep. Oh, and someone you mentioned about the Skull Canyon NUCs that it took some weeks so that even the ESXi install would work. I'm pretty sure I saw someone that released saying, "Hey, go into the BIOS and disable this feature, this feature," basically taking out everything that could cause a conflict for ESXi. So there's
Yeah, I
little things.
remember the early troubleshooting. It was a lot of BIOS settings, and it simply I remember the fix because this was at the height of me playing around with my lab. The fix was literally a BIOS update from Intel. It was a it was a uh, GPU issue.
Yeah, and the best part is I was thinking if someone is trying to learn about servers, period, right? This is a great example of the stuff that you might face one day with a Dell server or an HP
So
server.
and that's a great point. So one of the reasons why I didn't want to do, someone asked me why didn't I do the VMware hands-on training? Why didn't I do uh, the cloud? Or why didn't I just do one single host? I said I remember what, I'm not an engineer anymore, but I remember what it was like to be an engineer, and I learned the most from troubleshooting hardware. And I wanted to have the experience troubleshooting hardware. Even with the nested, where I have three nested ESXi hosts, that was the one thing that I was like, okay, it's more than a nice to have, especially since I don't get to play around with hardware in my day job anymore. That's the one thing that I personally want to get out of my lab. Troubleshooting the flash not coming up, troubleshooting the booting from the flash drive, the cabling issue, the stupid thing with the wrong size flash drive. Those things you don't get from a virtual lab, and if you still have to physically mess around with hardware, you won't learn those things from a virtual environment.
That's very correct. And plus, you get to figure out from going to the logs and trying to figure out how to get some help on the community, or if you could even open a support case. But in this case, you figure out where to find information and where to look. So I totally agree with you. It's a lot more. You learn a lot more. You experience a lot more. It's more rewarding, especially if it didn't work and then you got it working. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, you know what? I obviously spent a lot more time building the lab than using it. I'm not a vSphere guy anymore, so vSphere is functionally something that it is somewhere for me to be able to run VMs and learn other stuff. So now that I have this 3-node cluster that has some redundancy in it, I can throw VMs in this. I can throw, maybe I'll play around with Vic or some cluster management platform. But this is just a great cluster for me to be able to throw. I have 96 gigs, 6 cores that I can oversubscribe, and I'm going to consume vSphere like any other internal developer or customer would consume vSphere. And the advantages are that I get to muck around and learn some vSphere stuff every now and again.
Awesome. Now I do
All
know
right,
that
so that's all I had. Did
several.
anybody have any other questions? Want to see anything else
Yeah,
in
and I
the?
actually, I know that several people in assistance today have vSAN NUC labs, so I want to invite them. Just up, use the raise hand option. I would like to invite you to go ahead and on the recording and say, hey, I built my home lab and this is how I built it and this is how my configuration differs. And if you had any other problems that maybe someone else that is hearing the podcast later will say, oh, well, I chose the same thing and I had the same problem. Thank you for telling me how you fixed it. I am looking at you, Tom Green.
Yeah, Tom Green. Well, we can call you out on Twitter too if that helps.
I just unmuted him. There you go, Tom. You have control over your microphone.
Yeah, I'm actually working on getting the SSD layer going in my lab. I did end up getting a second NIC just so I could use I/O control on a switch. I've got everything on a standard switch right now for management. But how are you getting around that? Are you just using a standard switch?
I'm just using a standard switch, and plus I don't care about I/O control. I think you hit on an important fact and a important limitation of the single NIC. If you want to do any advanced networking, and especially if you want to throw something like NSX into the lab, like this wouldn't be a practical lab for me to run NSX beyond the memory and CPU constraints that I have. Just the simple limitation of not having enough physical NICs to make any sense and get real value out of it, that's a serious limitation. So that the USB to Ethernet option, I think, is a real strong option if you still are hell-bent on doing a NUC lab. But getting past the one NIC limitation is, I think, an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I've had too many things go south putting my management on a distributed switch, so 2 NICs is kind of a need if you have to mess with distributed switches at all for learning them.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it, you coming out. I've called you out twice by now. All right. Well, I do have. Do I have someone else that wants to speak out before we finish the call? If not, I really want to thank Keith for, like you said, this is a topic that nerds will talk and talk and talk, but I really think it's a valuable contribution for everybody to have something that they can always go back and reference. So thank you very much.
I appreciate everyone joining. The next vBrownBag is even more, I think, the topic that I really love talking about, which is careers. And how do you get to this point in your career that you're me and you don't know how to get to disk groups? And, if you ever want to be able to not know how to get to disk groups in vSphere, I'm really good at talking you through how you get to the point where you don't know the details about the technology anymore, and you reach that architect layer where you just talk about this from an abstracted perspective. And
that's great that you mentioned it, because we still have quite an audience here. Path to Architect, I think, is the name of the talk, right?
Yes.
So that's going to be October 12th, which is next Wednesday. And that is basically what, at the CTO advisor does. He basically is all the time working at the architect level. So make sure you come in, and especially because I know that, including myself, several of us are looking at taking VCDX at some point. This should be a great vBrownBag. Yeah, so
on that talk, I'll talk through the kind of becoming the, VCDX when we look at folks like in the community like Tim from Tim and Chris Wall and all those guys that know the deep technical stuff, to even beyond that from a different aspect. I'll talk about the different aspects of architect. So I'm no longer that technical architect, and we'll talk about that technical architect route, and we'll also talk about that architect route where, people don't let you touch a keyboard anymore, which is where I'm at. So I think it'll be a fun conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I'll start the recording. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you next week.